Hello, my name is Nick Salmon. I'm a educational facility planner with the Collaborative Learning Network in Missoula, Montana. But I'm here to share with you some ideas about resilient communities, resilient facilities, and resilient learners. And actually, I'm going to focus just on strategies for resilience in communities across Georgia. The start of the work that I've done here in Georgia with the Georgia Conservancy began with some work in Billings, Montana, around school site selection. And in that work, I encountered some wonderful ideas that Georgia Conservancy had developed, as well as the work we were doing together with CSRA for the EPA in the development of the school siting tool. And there are some examples here that you can see in the various slides that illustrate how this process can be used to help communities identify what they value and how they can draw together important partners and make decisions that will persist in the landscape over time. A few simple case studies emerged out of that work in a small school in Missoula, Montana, on an urban site surrounded by four streets and all the attending infrastructure. And this was a case where a school over a 99-year period had been redeveloped many times and expanded, but had been simply worn out. And the wonderful thing about the reuse of this site was that they could save, the school district saved about $500,000 in infrastructure they didn't need to extend to a site, and probably more than $1 million in not having to acquire a new site. So that was one simple example of the value to a community of reuse. The tool was also used to help the community select from 3 or 4 different sites a brand new school site at the edge of town. And the concerns were about the site, of the size of the site, and whether it was sloped or not, and whether it had proximity to kids and proximity to other schools, things like that. And all of those factors were built into the school siting tool and ultimately led to the selection of the site that is actually now being developed. Another case study comes from Anaconda, Montana, which is a community that lost a significant portion, 60% of its enrollment over a 30-year period with the closure of a major industry. And the challenge in that community was we have 6 different school properties. We really can operate effectively on 2, but which sites should be redeveloped and which sites should be sold off. In this case, the details of the tool became quite helpful, including looking at the network of streets surrounding the community, whether there was a single point of access or multiple points of access to the school site, how many lanes of traffic and the kind of level of traffic around each of those sites, and whether there were any barriers for students to either bike or walk to the school site. All of those elements are integrated into the school siting tool, and for comparison, I just selected 3 of these, one which we called the busy highway site, one which had great proximity to kids, and one which was a reuse of a former school site. And on these images that you'll see, the scores varied quite a bit, and what was most important is that the scores opened up conversation with the community as to what was important to them. Was it the proximity to the students? Was it the location of the site? Things like that. And ultimately, it ended up being the site that had the average score actually scored the most effectively. Just for a little more detail, the site that was on the busy highway isolated students from the school. So although it had proximity to students, crossing that highway became a significant barrier. And it was determined that selling that property off would be a more effective use of the community's resources. The other site that had the greatest proximity to students was on a very small parcel, and it was actually bisected by utilities, and it made it actually very difficult to expand. So though it had the great proximity to kids, it had some other constraints that made it a challenge to redevelop. And so reusing an existing brownfield site and a former school site that gained some additional value of sharing resources between the city and the school became a great benefit and the preferred alternative for that community. So what I typically like to do in a presentation is not just share information, but to ask questions. And there are a few questions that I think are helpful to for anyone watching this or participating in a workshop in the future, to ask yourself, why do we default to the typical 5, 12, and 20 acre assumptions for school sites? And how are you engaging the community in the site selection process? And what does your community value? Please take some time and think about those questions and discuss them and make them a part of your planning effort. The next thing I'd like to do is just share with you maybe about 20 different examples of great partnerships, strategies that are being used all around North America and elsewhere around the world, but these are primarily from the US and Canada. And I'm going to begin with an example out of New Orleans. And in every case, these images that you'll see include the population, just so you have an idea. Is this a community similar in size to ours or not? So in New Orleans, of course, the floods from Katrina devastated the community, and in the most impacted area, greater than 10 feet of flooding, there's this wonderful school called Our School at Blair Grocery. Kids are running a neighborhood school, grocery store, and community garden, and that is their school experience. It's a part of the redevelopment of the Ninth Ward. It's a vital part of their learning experience, and it's vital to the community surrounding them that, as you might imagine, after the devastating floods, lack basic things like access to fresh food. Another wonderful school is in Gahanna, Ohio, and the first floor of this school is for a fitness center, a credit union, other businesses, and the students occupy the other 2 floors of the building, and they do internships in that school. And the vitality of that partnership is that students can develop great life skill experiences in the school, in the same building, but the businesses are invited in a very robust way. Another example is the Harlem Children's Zone. This is a school and community that looked at all the things that were needed beyond just work opportunities and saying, well, what about pre-care and health, preschool and healthcare, and medical clinics and all the other things that support getting young people from birth to college and beyond, and saying that the school and community will be more vital with each of those. A few other examples that I won't spend a lot of time on, but in Omaha, Nebraska, the idea of a public library and rec center being a part of a school is quite common around the country. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, there are many different business partners are integrated into the learning experience on campus. An interesting example from Canada, Martinsville High School, where the community built the athletic facilities, which you might imagine is hockey, on the high school campus, but the community came up with separate resources to build that facility rather than assuming that it came only from the residents of the school district. Another example from Regina, Saskatchewan, like the example of the Harlem Children's Zone, we have child care and elder needs being met. There's even, beyond the public library, there's even the community policing center is co-located on that site. An example from Germantown, Maryland, their Parks and Recreation provides before and after school care, and runs a health center on that campus. Baltimore schools think of transit differently, and the 30,000 students use public transit to get to school every day. even here in Georgia in Rome City, for the Rome School District, the primary means of transportation is provided by the Rome Transit District. That's also true in Raleigh, North Carolina, where they're also doing not just the transit side of things, but community centers, libraries, etc. The Workshop School in Philadelphia is a school that I've spent some time with, and they acknowledge that they are living within a food desert, and the young people in that school operate a food truck where they both grow and prepare and then sell food throughout their community, fresh food that helps kind of revitalize the community on a very essential basis. A more common thing is entrepreneurial opportunity within school around food. It happens to be around coffee. And whether that's in Livingston, Michigan, or anywhere else, whether those coffee carts are run by students or parent volunteers, they add some interesting opportunities for young people within the school. In Charlotte, North Carolina, there's an interesting co-location of public transit, a soccer field, and the public school setting, all linked to the major light rail system within the community. In Cincinnati, community learning centers are integrated into almost every single school. And again, like the examples in Harlem and elsewhere, looking at all the needs that are, looking at everything that is needed within the community, from preschool to daycare to after-school programs to arts and culture, all those things become an important part of the vitality of each school and each neighborhood. Same ideas, again, internationally are occurring throughout Toronto, where 21 different schools are also community learning centers. Up north in Ohio, in Akron, the sharing of schools with many different needs are quite common, whether it's the gymnasiums and libraries and classrooms for adult education, but also city staff working on a school site in order to coordinate the use of all those spaces so it doesn't become a burden to the school district. It becomes a shared responsibility. The last example is from Burlington, Vermont, again up north, but in a small community that has a large impoverished population. They wanted to introduce some really wonderful programs in performing arts as well as sustainable living, and those programs became placed in the most impoverished schools instead of the most affluent schools, with the idea being that they would increase the quality of teaching and learning within those school sites, and that more affluent students who were intrigued by those offerings would travel to that site. And each of those programs relies on important partners, higher education partners, museum partners, arts partners across the city. Again, I love to throw a few essential questions at anyone, and I think it's great to develop a list of who your partners in success might be, and ask yourself, what is our plan for doing more with less? I think that what we see happening in the world around us, global economic competition, fewer resources available from various levels of government, it's important that schools and communities look at ways for achieving even more needs or meeting even more demands, but with different assumptions about where those resources come from. One last thing I want to share are just a few wonderful examples of students doing internships as a way of building upon those partnerships. And it involves everything from working half a day to all day, a couple times a week, etc. And one of the schools that piloted this program is Cristo Rey. And in this case, five students share a job over the course of a week. And these are real paying jobs. And the resources that they derive from that go to the school, and the school pays the student, and the school retains some. In these cases, it's a private school, but there's no reason why a public school couldn't implement the same kind of thinking. And these students are doing life-changing kind of work, whether it's in the health fields or insurance or working for attorneys, engineers, etc. They're doing some wonderfully vital things. And there's a program here in Atlanta. I was there this morning, and nationwide, there's a network of more than 30 schools. Somewhere around 18,000 students have been educated in this model, and sharing these work opportunities, and again, changing their lives through those experiences. There's another school network called the Big Picture Learning Network, and the school that I worked with up in Newport, Rhode Island. And in that case, the students work all day, twice a week, and they often work for 4 contiguous years in an area of work that they are particularly passionate about. And so you're finding student interest, and you're finding a community partner, and those elements come together and really support some wonderful learning opportunities for young people. So I guess the essential question that would come out of this are, what internship opportunities exist in your community, and how are you taking advantage of them? I guess as a closing here, I'd like to have you take a moment or two to just kind of reflect on, why is resilience important to your community, and to your facilities and to the young people in your community, and how is it best achieved in your community, and how will you integrate this into your future practices? I look forward to continuing this conversation, not necessarily in a recorded setting, but in a more dynamic setting, and seeing where each of you takes this conversation.